Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, I'm going to, we're going to talk this morning about Portugal. And on my True Social, we have uh, someone who has done some additional digging into Gladio in Sweden. And I was just reading one of her posts and she wrote a Substack article. So I'm going to repost that and highly encourage everybody to um, read her article. She did a really good job, or he did. Um, and kind of the reason why I picked the um, Greece is because Greece was very unique in the fact that they had so much political turmoil going on in addition to World War II and the aftermath with the civil conflict. It's similar to Spain, and the analogy between Spain and Portugal kind of bleeds over into each other, as you're going to find out today. But another unique area is the Scandinavian countries, because we know they're, in some ways, they're similar, but each one of them have their unique aspects. And what I found interesting is in Ganser's book that I briefly mentioned yesterday, she doesn't have a chapter on Sweden. So I really appreciate that post and explaining just how it connects, because I think some people mistakenly believe that Sweden was neutral, both in World War II and afterwards. And they definitely have not been neutral. They've been actively involved, just like Switzerland. Um, but they do have, let's see, which one was I just looking at? They have Norway, and I was briefly going over them, and I will at the end kind of highlight a couple of aspects of Norway, because actually it's kind of ironic. But anyway, let's get started with Portugal. So in March of 1926, General Costa staged a military coup in Portugal. And yes, 1926 is way before World War II and the stay behind units, but it kind of, you have to understand a little bit of the history to understand the dynamics going on there. He abolished the Constitution and Parliament and turned the government into a dictatorship. And so some people might ask, why would you need stay behind units if you're a dictator? Because you control everything. And that's actually the reason why I picked Portugal, because it is a very interesting dynamic going on. Because even when you're a dictatorship, there are things that you don't want people to know, because it adds to the instability and potentially a rebellion against your dictatorship. So there's quite a bit of information that gets squashed. Um, so the dictatorship is a very interesting one because it implemented an authoritarian regime which incorporated social Catholicism. And I found that term very interesting because we understand, like in a lot of the exposure that we did in South America, how the Catholic religion in like Argentina, um, and Brazil played a very big role in not only necessarily Gladio itself, but in maintaining authoritarian regimes. And I just find that fascinating because they seem to be um, at opposite ends of the spectrum. But you find in the exposure of Gladio, and I have to tell you, I'm suspect as to all of the reasons why Gladio in the United States has been kept such a secret, when you find throughout the rest of the world Almost everybody knows about it. So eventually in 1933, he was succeeded by a dictator by the name of Salazar. Salazar supported the Spanish Civil War, in which dictator Franco took over. And so now you have Portugal right next to Spain, and both of them are being led in the 1930s on by dictators. And I got to be honest with you, I've never been a Spain history buff, and I didn't know. I didn't know Portugal had a dictator for decades. These dictators remained neutral during World War II, but they were on the same footing as Hitler and Mussolini because they were all dictators. However, after World War II, when both Hitler and Mussolini are now out of the picture, Salazar and Franco found themselves in a very awkward position because now everybody in Europe is kind of anti-dictator, and but because they were anti-communist, they were able to maintain their dictatorships. And what we have found in discovering Gladio is there's a lot of fascist aspects to it as far as the control over the people, creating terror anytime your government is questioned about anything or becomes unstable to get the people back in line. So I I have come to realize that their use of the word democracy is really fascism in disguise when you find out all of these infrastructure pieces that they put together for their democracy. Portugal became a founding member of NATO. Let that sink in. They're a dictator. Supposedly, we fought World War II to get rid of dictators. And he remained in charge, excuse me, he remained in charge of Portugal until 1968. It was after his death that Portugal eventually became a member of the EU. Portugal had a military secret police they called PIDE. Because Portugal remained a dictatorship, it was difficult to determine where the secret police ended and where the Gladio stay behind units began. That was until 1990. And they got caught up in the exposure that bled over from Italy. Because remember, I was telling you that when the exposure in Italy started, it kind of blew up the entire European Gladio network. And there were some governments that was saying, no, I'm not involved in that. And then the Andreotti guy goes, oh, yes, you were. You were at the meeting last month. So no one escaped that exposure. The Gladio units in Portugal were used to prop up the fascist regime. They went by and remember how I told you, like, the Gladio 2 in South America was called Operation Condor. All of them, for anonymity reasons, also adopted, like the ones in Turkey were called wolf units. So in Portugal, they're called Agenter Press, Aginter Press. So that's just another name for Gladio. A newspaper in 1990 informed a stunned audience that the secret network erected at the bottom of NATO and financed by the CIA, the existence of which has recently been revealed by Andrea Otti, had a branch in Portugal in the 1960s and 70s. It was called Agenter Press and was allegedly involved in the assassination operations in Portugal as well as Portuguese colonies in Africa. And that's another interesting aspect. Anybody that had these Gladio units that still had colonies, it bled over to all of them. And they used them to create instability in their colonies in case of an uprising. A subordinate unit of Agenter Press was called OACI, also operated in Italy when Italian senators found that the CIA had supported a Agenter press in Portugal. It was led by a captain by the name of Yves Julian Serac, Serac, a specialist in secret warfare who received medals from the United States. Yeah, a foreigner. We gave him a Bronze Star for his involvement in the Korean War. What's very interesting about that is, remember what we were talking about this whole thing is tied to the opium trade all over the world. And it kind of follows, because that's how the CIA and all the intel agencies paid for the Gladio units, by selling drugs. And I'm now discovering some ties, just like in Vietnam, to the opium production that happened in the Korean Peninsula. So I find it interesting that some of these people are traced back as far as the Korean War in their involvement in these stay behind units. Italian Judge Silvani studied documents on Agenter Press and, quote, is the American Secret Service or CIA, unquote. That's how he diagnosed it. He was asked, according to your analysis, who was directly responsible for the operations carried out by Agenter Press. Judge Silvani replied, you have asked a very important question now. Due to the political sensitivities of the answer, he demanded that he had to answer it in secret session only when he was in front of the Italian parliament. The name Agenter Press was officially adopted in Portugal in 1966. Domestic operations seem to have been much more important to Portugal than the Soviet invasion, because the Soviet invasion was a myth. These forces, or an excuse to create these units, these forces were used to suppress Vietnam War activists because they feared the destabilizing effect of the social movement. Many in these Gladio units had previously fought against African colony independence movements as well, like Algeria. So Serac was a Catholic militant who had fought on behalf of the French and on behalf of the French in Vietnam. He was also a veteran of the Korean War, which obviously had something to do with the American side because they gave him a medal for it. A veteran of the French War in Algeria. He was also part of the French units that tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. And remember, that's key, because the people that tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle, at least two of them are the same ones that came to Dallas to assassinate JFK. After de Gaulle closed down the OAS, the officers fled to other countries. Serac was hired by dictator Franco in Spain and employed his skills in the Spanish Secret Service. From Spain, he moved to Portugal and participated in their Gladio movement. So he's basically like a mercenary. And the CIA in Portugal, Gladio units set up training camps and instructed mercenaries and terrorists in 3-week courses. And we read about those when we were doing the book review on the Italian Gladio unit, because Italy sent not their Gladio people, not just to Sardinia, but they sent them to the Portugal terror camps. They learned how to do hands-on bomb terrorism, silent assassination, and subversive techniques, clandestine communications, infiltration, and colonial warfare. It's the gift that keeps giving. Serac said 2 forms of terrorism can provocate a situation. Blind terrorism, which is committing massacres indiscriminately, which cause large numbers of victims, and the second one is selective terrorism, eliminating a chosen person, basically an assassination. In each case, he said the terror had to be carried out secretly by the extreme right in order to blame it on the left under the guise of anti-communist terror. This destruction of the state must be carried out as much as possible under the cover of communist activities, unquote. He further states, terrorist attacks were designed to discredit the ruling party, not currently in favor, and force it to shift to the right. After that, we must intervene at the heart of the military, the justice system, and the church in order to influence popular opinion, suggest a solution, and clearly demonstrate the weakness of the present legal apparatus. Sounds like what's going on here. Popular opinion must be polarized in such a way that we are being presented as the only instrument capable of saving the nation. It is obvious that we will need considerable financial resources to carry out such operations. One Gladio document is quoted as saying, "Our belief is that the first phase of political activity ought to be to create the conditions favoring the installation of chaos in all of the regime structures. The violence had to be blamed on the communists, and traces of evidence had to be planted according to our view. The first move we should make is to destroy the structure of the democratic state under the cover of communist and pro-Chinese activities." It would go on to say that such false flag operations will create a feeling of hostility towards those who threaten the peace in each and every nation, i.e., the communists. So, again, this makes you question every foundation you've ever had. So now what's the real truth with the Chinese police stations? I don't know. When it's like crying wolf, when you lie to me so often, I now don't believe anything you say. So who's the real bad guys? Because they constantly blame everybody else for all of the stuff they do. It's frightening. A Genter press, what is deployed by Portugal to suppress the independence movement in the African colonies. It was focused against the liberation movement of African colonies of Portugal no longer wanting to be under the Portugal dictatorship. And it sought the liquidation of leaders of that movement through infiltration and installation of informers, provocateurs, and the utilization of a false liberation movement to run alongside an actual liberation so they could infiltrate this one and learn about the other one. They're devious. Those actions were documented in Mozambique, Angola, and East Timor, which at the time were all Portuguese colonies. A Genter press had trained many Italian gladios on explosives and tactics. A CIA operative by the name of J. Sablonsky, Sablonsky, was a Green Beret and a Genter press counter-terrorist operator in Guatemala, which ended with over 50,000 dead civilians. And all of these same people, which are like basically mercenaries under the Gladio auspices, were also found in Chile, which we read a lot about. May of 1974, the Revolution of Flowers abolished the dictatorship and paved the way for democracy in Portugal. A Genter press wasn't going to go peacefully, though, and they planned to take over the Azores and use it as a staging platform. And for those of you that don't know, Azores is off the coast of Portugal and falls under the Portuguese government system. They weren't able to accomplish this, and the new police raided their offices. All of the agents were gone because they had gotten advanced warning. Some documents were left behind, which implicated the CIA as part of the Genter Press Gladio organization. The new government was committed to setting up a commission. However, it was very short-lived as the documents all were stolen. Later, an Italian journalist would recall being present when the original raid occurred. My colleagues were present back then during the the commission investigation on when they entered when they were trying to archive the documents that they found. I managed to take a few pictures of parts, but only small parts of a very large amount of confiscated data. He said the documents were destroyed by the Portuguese military because they implicated NATO, since Gladio was ran out of NATO headquarters. Eventually, the PIDE was investigated and said the Gladio structure had 4 tasks: espionage for the CIA, NATO, and German intelligence, which of course we know is where Gladio originally came from. Number 2, recruiting and training mercenaries and terrorists for bombs and assassinations. 3, strategic center for neo-fascist indoctrination in Africa, South America, and Europe. Now, again, bringing that home to today, neo-fascist in Ukraine. We have had lots of reports of members of Antifa and BLM being trained in Ukraine. So what better place to stage? So now in 1990, all of the Gladio networks have been exposed, right? Because of Italy and doing the investigation. So there's all over throughout the 90s, all of this exposure happens. And if you're going to hide it and not get rid of it, and you need training places, what better place to do that than a democracy that's not in NATO? That's Ukraine. There's a reason why all of this time Ukraine has never been put in NATO or the EU. Plausible deniability. Back to the list. Last, international fascists with clandestine paramilitary funding and training. So now this is important. The Gladio structure, 4 tasks: espionage, intelligence gathering, neo-fascist indoctrination, international fascist with clandestine paramilitary funding and training. Does that not sound like Hitler never lost World War II? Just saying. Surratt fled to fascist Spain in the aftermath of the Portugal dictatorship dissolving. He sought Franco's protection. Their headquarters was reestablished there, and they continued to create havoc in Algeria. And remember, Algeria is a French colony, or was. Bombs were planted in Algerian embassies in France, Germany, Italy, and UK. 4 big proponents of Gladio. And it's easy to do these sabotage things in those countries because there's lots of Gladio cells there to do them. All countries with the robust Gladio programs. The bomb at the German embassy didn't explode and was found to contain an explosive material that was only found at the time in US made bombs. Franco died in 1975 and the dictatorship there dissolved. So Surratt is now without a home again. And the Spanish investigation indicated that they'd left behind weapons and explosives in the headquarters where Surratt had been working. They also turned up in another CIA created dictatorship, which was in Chile. So if allowed, let's see, a Portuguese general who had been chief of the Portuguese chief of staffs confirmed to a magazine that, quote, a parallel operation and information service headed by the Gladio units did exist in Portugal and its colonies. The financing in command of which is the arms used, the forces used, but was supposedly dependent upon the defense ministry in Portugal for much of its support. It also was embedded in the Interior Ministry and the Ministry of Colonial Affairs. This parallel operation and information system, the general confirmed, was also directly linked to PIDE, which was basically Portugal's secret police. Despite this, no parliamentary investigation was ever conducted. And I just want to tie this back to another book review we did called The Third Way. You remember that the Madrid Circular in 1950 was written in Spain by a group of displaced Nazis that had been moved to Spain. They basically moved their, excuse me, fascist coordination center to Spain. And the irony of all ironies is it was the perfect place to do that because you already had a fascist dictator in charge of Spain. So, and so that is what they had written on Portugal. Unfortunately, most of the other European countries do not have near the documentation, if you will, on the Gladio units. We have some of the circumstantial evidence as far as internal terrorist acts, but nothing that ties them to them because none of them would do an investigation. Unlike Italy, who basically kind of blew the roof off of everything. Excuse me. So I did want to go based on our Swedish friend mentioning the Scandinavian countries and kind of talk about a little bit on the Norway side, because it's very interesting that Norway had a very naive approach to buying into implementing Gladio. They actually believed that it was because they had been invaded by Hitler. They believed that it was to prevent that from happening again. They slowly but surely found out as they were implementing it that that wasn't what it was for at all. And they were indignant. They were pissed, actually. They discovered quite inadvertently that NATO had created a blacklist of people that at high levels of the European governments that would be suspect in the exposure of Gladio in case, like they needed to take them out for a quick cover-up job. And Norway was discovered that there were several of their political figures that was on that list, and they were pissed. So they basically said, we're out. We're not messing with you guys anymore. You lied to us. They were coaxed back in and rejoined the NATO Stay Behind unit and started attending the meetings again. So part of what was later discovered, and I wanted to read this is a document signed by General J.P. McConnell, Vice Commander of the U.S. forces in Europe. And it explained most sensitively that under special circumstances, the U.S. shall intervene in European NATO countries even without the consent of the national government in order to suppress domestic unrest. Quote, if these initiatives do not suffice, or in case the government concerned asks for assistance, or if the commander of the U.S. forces comes himself to the conclusion that the government is not able to suppress such unrest, then the U.S. troops can carry out these measures deemed necessary by the U.S. commander on their own initiative or in cooperation with the government concerned, unquote. So basically, whoever is the commander of Europe for the United States can just go invade people's country on his own decision. That that's shocking. That's shocking, especially given I know some of the people that's out that job. That's shocking. That's just downright crazy. So, um, I wanted to quote another section of this book. And this book, NATO Secret Army, Danielle Ganser. The beauty of this book, it doesn't add anything new that we haven't covered in the general um, concepts of Gladio. But what it does is it digs down into each country that she talks about and gives you some specific examples outside of Italy in a more in-depth way. So it's a very interesting book. So here's another quote. As the scandal unfolded, the Norwegian parliament became involved and was stunned to learn that from the defense minister that a secret resistance network had been formed after the war. According to his explanations, the network had originated from private groups that, however, had been placed under the supervision of the Norwegian Secret Service. Aware of the sensitive situation, he claimed that the Norwegian network was not answerable to NATO or other countries, dismissing any connections to the CIA, but he would not discuss the details, saying the organization's activities had to be kept secret. They were, and then she, of course, says they're misleading. They're a downright lie. Um, and then goes on, by coincidence, the strongest evidence contradicting this claim that the CIA was not involved in the secret operation surfaced exactly the same year as his testifying in front of Parliament when former CIA director William Colby published his memoirs. In his book, written to enhance the public image of the CIA, Colby proudly related how he had been involved in setting up secret armies in the north of Europe, including Norway, from 1951 to 1953, when he was a young CIA agent assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Stockholm. And that's important for our Swedish, who I see she's here, or he's here, whichever, um, because I would definitely suggest to you in following the William Colby angle. He was at, as we just read, the Stockholm, Sweden, and he is the one that helped set up your stay behind units. And also, he fell out of favor with this cabal international syndicate and they murdered him. So he did and said some things towards the end of his career that made him a huge security risk. And, you know, I don't know if y'all, I assume all of us know, but he supposedly having done CIA work his whole life and would not be not on his guard all the time, was having lunch in his house and had his computer open, had the television on, and a half eaten lunch on the table. And supposedly, the story we were fed was he just walks out the back door down to the boat dock and goes missing. And several days later, he's found floating in the river, which, you know, come on, that's not at all what happened. And we all know that. Um, so, yeah, any place William Colby was is not a good place to be. All right, let me go through some of the notes here and see. Um, yeah, I found it, Bridget, I too found it very interesting when I discovered the America First had been a slogan back in the days um, after World War One. There was a huge outcry to not ever do that again. And of course, we know that that is exactly what happened. Um, but yeah, I feel like, and I know all of y'all agree, that someone, some group has went through our history and taken every aspect of the bullshit from the international syndicate and used whatever the opposition was at that time that they overwhelmingly was able to squash, like the America First people, and Trump picked out every piece of that. And if somebody someday can take every slogan or every, like the snake, there's something more about that snake um, poem that he reads than what we have been led to believe so far. There's some connection there to the international syndicate in a deeper way. And I feel like every single thing he's used like that goes back and pokes them in the eye, like he's mocking them every single time. And we will come across these pieces as we go um, and need to really make sure that we give it as much publicity as we can. Um, let's see what else makes a question. Everything the meetings, every single thing, Bridget. You're so right. Um, we have no idea. I, I'm, I'm, one of the best examples of that is in reading about. And I'm not saying that a good intended operation doesn't turn out bad in the long run. And the example that I use when I'm talking to people is we've been told every aspect about Cuba um, and the leadership there is bad, 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 bad. Everything about it's bad. But if you go back prior to their revolution and you realize that island had been infiltrated with mafia. They had taken over every aspect. They bought the um, Western friendly quasi dictator that was there. It was not a democracy. There was nothing good about Cuba at the time. Mafia owned everything in Havana, everything. They ran everything. They were taking young women, not necessarily even 18 years old, and prostituting them for their people that came to visit them. It was the center of drug trades, as we have found out in Operation Gladio. All of the drugs that was being manufactured in Sicily was being ran through Cuba up into Miami and New York. It was a hotbed of mess. Well, there was a group of people, resistance, if you will, that got together and threw them all out. You can't say that's a bad thing. They raped and pillaged that island for their own use. And when someone does that, there is the possibility. And again, I don't know. I've never lived on in Cuba. I've never had anything to do with Cuba. Um, but there there's the possibility once someone gains power that they're going to use that power in a corrupt way, even if the power was originally intended for good, which you cannot make an argument that what was going on in Cuba prior to the revolution was good, because it was not. And it was manipulated in many ways by Americans. Um, the mafia that went down there was from America. It was embedded with CIA operatives who were trafficking the drugs through there. So again, we come back to a place where we find ourselves in this Operation Gladio story every single time. We, not Americans, but we, the US government, has fomented hatred and chaos through our intel infrastructures in conjunction with Mossad, MI5 and 6, BND in Germany, all of them. They're all in bed together. They go around in our names because they're embedded in our governments and foment this chaos. And the resistance to their chaos is then communist and bad. And they'll do anything to be able to put down that resistance so they can go back to business as normal. And we're all given a lie as to what's happening. So when you say that there's more than we thought, they're everywhere. So we've already proven that they're in South America, they're in Europe. They never were just European. They're in all of the former colonies, which is basically the entire continent of Africa. We documented that they were in Asia because they were elements of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and I notice that there's other labels like Gladio 2 and Gladio B. That's it's literally everywhere. So Turkey took theirs and moved them through the stands. And the whole Golden Triangle had them. They they were part of the apparatus that did the coup in Iran. So yeah, they're everywhere. Um, our Gladio stay behind units, CIA ops. Yes, yes, Bridget. Strategy of tension. It's on our border. You're not going to convince me that the intel organizations that have done all of this and control so much of what's going on behind the scenes is not controlling our border. We tied the CIA to the major cartels down there. I think it's a Gladio unit in disguise of a cartel. Um, it's just a mask they wear. Um, and the Gladio Antifa is very much a Gladio operation, 1000%. So is BLM. It's all fascist, Marxist, whatever label you want to put on. And that's the reason why I came to the conclusion that I call it the International Syndicate and stop trying to put it to a political or a financial ideology, you know what I mean, idea, because it's they will use any face. They're CIA, Intel, they have a mask for everything. So I'm going to put on my Antifa mask. I'm going to put on my BLM mask. I'm going to put on my fascist mask. I'm going to put on whatever organization that you want to align them to. And you may think that you're getting too simplistic, but if you think about it, if you back up, I've been in planning cells for operations. If you had a concept that was a very simple concept, and that concept was stay behind units, it's a very simple concept. And I could just have in my spy closet 50 different masks. And all I do is I open it and I pull out a mask and I put it on my head. I'm still the same Gladio stay behind unit, but I can pretend to be communist. I can pretend to be a BLM person. I can pretend to be a Antifa person. It's just a different mask of the same concept. And if I was planning at a military operational, um, let's just say the Joint Staff or NATO, this is exactly what I would plan. So, What else we got? Yeah, I've said that American Guerrilla from the very beginning. Anti-fascist is a bullshit mask. They are fascist in every aspect of what they do. Um, let's see what else we got. Yeah, and that's a great point that the NATO commanders, all for the very beginning. So let's go over this for just a second. So you have NATO. Well, let's back up. In 1942, we know without a doubt they're stay behind units, and that Galen, through General Wolfe and himself and another guy, was planting them in every. Not that they weren't already there. We just know in 1942 they were there. In every Axis occupied country, their stay behind units. He then uses their presence to buy his freedom from Allen Dulles, who was OSS over this entire area now because the war's over in 1945. And Galen and Dulles meets and says, okay, basically, I'm going to sell you my Gladio network, and you're going to agree that I get to stay out of Nuremberg and I get to stay in my job for the new Adenauer administration coming in Germany. So you have the guy that set up Gladio in charge of basically the B&D in Germany. He's still in charge. And then Germany takes over for this at least the first decade in all of the major positions that really matter in NATO. So here's Mr. Gladio. Here's the structure that we're going to fold Gladio into. Hello, they're still ran by the guys they were ran by in 1942. Nothing changed. So that's why this is so incredible as a find that Germany did not lose World War II. They restructured the this evil, if you will, and continued to fight. They're just doing it in a stay behind, smaller footprint all over the world. They've controlled everything since. They manipulated us. So it's once you see the big picture, it's the perfect strategy. If in 1942 I decide that winning the war in an outright win, there's going to be too many elements across the world that's still going to fight me. Why do I want to win outright? I could change my strategy is still the same. One world government and I'm in charge. Okay. That's the strategy. At the operational and tactical level, which is how you think of a war campaign, if I change my operational strategy to be stay behind, and my tactics is going to be guerrilla warfare of manipulating all of the countries at the same time via this Gladio network, I can win the war and by that infiltration process, not be able to control any resistance that comes up. Which, if I won the war outright, I still got to do a lot of shit. I still got invade a lot of countries. I still got do a lot of hardware production. It's too hard. Why would I do that? I now have the perfect strategy, the perfect operational campaign to implement that strategy or accomplish the strategy, and the tactics to do it. And by God, I'm going to do it. And look how far they got because they're still operating today. The only thing they did as they went along is substituted the boogeyman. So the Soviet Union was the boogeyman until 91 when they didn't exist anymore. China, the communist China, was created by the same guys that created the communist Soviets. So now they're the boogeyman. And let's throw in a religious boogeyman. We're going to use um, Islam as the boogeyman behind the terror network because I don't have the Soviets anymore. I don't have the KGB to be the infiltrators that I'm always trying to thwart. So now I've got a built in terror network, which, by the way, I created. Go back and look at the funding. Condoleezza Rice ties to ISIS, the Hamas, and they're all um, bin Laden, the Taliban, all things that our CIA funded initially. And then they walk away from, supposedly, which they never did because they're basically stay behind units. Um, so let's see. Remember, Stalin had intel source. Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics on the who actually was in charge versus Hitler versus Galen. Um, Galen, we know, is the one that survived through the whole thing and lived to fight another day. So you can definitely make the argument that he was doing some, um, but there's people that believe that Hitler um, um, wasn't killed. We also discovered that the in the third way in that book review that we did that one of the um, operational goals in changing that focus from an all-out warfare approach to conquering the world was going to be this uh, diversification strategy, and they had to come up with a way to sneak some of their strategic leaders, operational leaders, out of Germany. And the assassination attempt on Hitler was one of those vehicles. So supposedly they arrested and executed all of these big name guys that was intricately involved in Hitler. When they didn't execute them at all, they basically snuck them out. Because as the third way guy points out, you don't hunt for dead people. And it was a brilliant way to smuggle people out of Germany by saying you killed them. So there's just so much here. And I'm not going to stop talking about it. Um, I'm going to wait till we get home to do our next book. And I'm there's one more book I think that's very relevant, but I'm not sure I want to do that next. But I just have to keep. I will do it. We just have to keep punching on this because I think this is the key to so much, and so many people don't even know about it. All right, I taught Czech intel ran Cuba DGI funded by Russians to cause the riots in black neighborhoods. The Summer of Rage. Oh, yeah, gosh. That's very interesting. Um, yeah. And again, I think everything that we were taught about the Soviet Union, um, the fact that it was initially created by the Jewish Bolsheviks, and that the everything about it fits the paradigm that if I'm going to go in and I'm going to depose and murder the king, um, then I'm all of our industrialists immediately under the guise of Red Cross and everything else go swarming into the country. You've got Ford putting manufacturing capability there. You got GE electrifying the entire country, um, and so on and so on. So these are all back in the day virgin territories, because you're talking about in the um, late 19 teens and 1920 timeframe. So all of the industrial, the railroads, all of the railroads in Russia were built by American companies. So they go in and they industrialize these countries. And it's much easier to do if you have a dictator because you only pay off the top guys. If you actually have a democracy or a republic, there's way too much shit that you have to go through in order to capture the government. So it's much better that you go in and decapitate them, put in your stooge, because we know Trotsky and Lenin both came from Trotsky from New York City, where he was bought and paid for, and Lenin from London, bought and paid for. So we already have our stooge, and we're going to go put them over there. We're going to go in and completely um, uh, monopolize every and basically take all of the money that people have to then take all of the resources people have. You have to have railroads to get the resources, and country after country after country. And we talked about them doing it in Brazil. We talked about them, and that was what Africa. These people are on record. The Cecil Rhodes Group, the Round Table, the Society of the Elect, which is just a laugh. Um, all are on record saying Africa will never be more than a slave colony for Europe. That's all it was. They wanted their resources and they wanted their manpower. That's how evil these people are. And every single leader in Africa, like Gaddafi, that stood up and said, "We're done. This is our shit. You can't have it. Excuse me, anymore." Were murdered. So there you go. Um, okay, so that's enough for now. Um, I I will be in touch once I get back home. We're going to be back home on Thursday, and we'll announce our next book. I'll give you guys a few days if you want to buy it, and we're going to keep on going. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I will tell you that if you guys haven't subscribed to the channel and done like a thumbs up thing, I guess by doing that, Brian Cates was telling me that it will come up on other people's feeds more so that we can get the word out more. Um, I don't make any money off of this, so I just want to get the word out as much as we can. Again, I appreciate you being here. I will talk to you soon.